Writing systems are a kind of lossy format. Well, first off, let's talk about what writing systems are. First, we have to go back to how language is actually developed. Most languages in the world have many kinds of varieties. And so out of all of these varieties, there was a need that developed in each country, in that people need to be able to communicate with each other even when they spoke very different languages or very different kinds of dialects from each other. And so standardized writing came into existence to kind of unify for a way for everybody within a country to be able to communicate with each other. And then out of that standardized writing system, slowly it started to take on a form of its own in speech. And so people actually started to speak like this standard writing system. So in certain kinds of countries, you'll find that, like in the Philippines, the most widespread language there was and still is Tagalog. But over time, the country actually decided to make a new language called Filipino as the national standard. Now, Tagalog itself doesn't really have a high register of speech, and so when they want to use a high register of speech in speaking to the population, they will switch to Filipino, which has borrowed a lot of things from English, for example, more complex ideas and concepts, and it also has from its history, it has a lot of borrowed words from Spanish as well, which you can also find in Tagalog as well. But from my personal experience in the Philippines, I found that most notices and signs are actually written in English because it's more of a more polite and formal way of communicating a message to the people rather than using a local language like Tagalog, and even in place of Filipino. So that's kind of interesting. In some languages like Finland, you'll find that most of the people in the country, they speak their own dialects and their own languages. And then the Finnish, the standard writing system is something that is used only in perhaps in television, in actual broadcasts. But even when people are on television speaking to each other in a very conversational way, they still use their own dialects. And so these dialects tend to have shorter words, whereas the Finnish standard language has really long words. We can find the same thing happening in Germany. The High German language developed out of a need to bring all of these different dialects. And so people start speaking High German as their standard language. A very good case study with Italian, Spanish, French. All of these languages are pretty much the same. Even if you go to England today, you'll find lots of regional varieties of English, but yet there is one received pronunciation standard for the country. And very few people actually speak like that all the time because it sounds like you're putting on airs and things. So the second thing is, what does writing system actually, what do they actually convey? Writing systems, there are two things that writing systems have. They have a sound component and they also have a meaning component. Now, when we actually read words, it doesn't really matter if you're a Chinese speaker or an English speaker. When you're reading the words off a page, you're never looking at the individual letters or strokes within a word or a character. You're actually reading in terms of groups of words or phrases all together, if you're an adult. And so most people read like this and they're just trying to get the meaning that is conveyed in that message as quickly as possible. When people write, they often make spelling mistakes, they miss out on a few things, and they don't really worry too much about it because what's more important is the meaning that they're trying to convey. And so spelling and these other details tend to take a second place priority. So if we compare Chinese and English, most people would think that English is a sound-based writing system and that Chinese is a meaning-based writing system, because a Chinese character looks like it's just a lot of scribbles all grouped together and it has one meaning. No sound there whatsoever. However, English and Chinese are almost the same thing. They're kind of a mix between sound and meaning, because the way Chinese people read is pretty much the same way that we read in English. We see groups and groups of words and characters together and we get the meaning from it right away. We're not always trying to transfer things to sounds and then use the sound to understand what's being said. We read for meaning. So the same thing in Chinese is that 90% of the characters are based off of a phonetic component, just as in English we have a really ancient writing system that has never been updated in spelling. And so the writing system is a very loose format of what the language actually sounds like. So both Chinese and English have this sound-based component in each word. However, over time, we mostly just write for the meaning. So we actually have different spellings of words that have the same sound in English just to identify different meanings. Like the word deer can be E-A-R or E-E-R, and you know by the writing which meaning it has. Same thing with Chinese. So when you look at, if you study computer science or you've studied anything about computers, you know what a lossy format is. If you see a picture that is very pixelated and you look at it up close, it just looks like a big garbled mess. You can't make any sense out of it. So the lossy format is what is the same thing with writing systems. Writing systems, they don't encode all the details of how you actually speak that language. And all of the sound changes that you make when you're speaking. Because what writing systems are is they basically need to have a common denominator among all of the users of that language. So for example, nowadays in the last 20 to 30 years, we're still discovering lots and lots of new languages in the world that are spoken by some small tribes somewhere in the forest or in the mountains. And so linguists will go in there and they'll actually try to decipher the languages and write them down. So what they use is the International Phonetic Alphabet, or called the IPA. And what the IPA does, what we have to do is analyze the different dialects within that region and then find out how can we write down the language, what are the common denominator of all the sounds from all the people speaking that language. And then we write it down in IPA, and then from IPA we can actually come up with a standard spelling system for that language. For example, in the Taiwan's indigenous languages spoken here in Taiwan, there's we first wrote the languages down with IPA, and so a lot of the languages have the letter Q, which in IPA is pronounced Q. It's a very deep, throaty sound, like you'll find in Arabic, like a double dotted Q in Arabic, and so that sound is actually, the Q from the IPA is actually borrowed. So if you look at Atayal or if you look at Amis language, you'll actually see the Q being written out in their standard writing system. So some things are actually borrowed and placed into the standard writing system. Some other sounds that are in the IPA, they don't have an easy to type letter, and so sometimes we use combination of sounds like HL or LH for hl. And you may notice that right now when I'm speaking, it sounds like a nondescript North American accent. You can probably tell right away that I'm not speaking with a British accent. So if I were to say a certain phrase like, let's say, better innovative solutions, you would be able to tell right away that I'm speaking North American accented English. However, if I were to change that immediately into saying better innovative solutions, then you'd be able to hear, just simply from changing my accent, I have a different placement of stress. Innovative becomes innovative, better becomes better or better. And so there's certain other things that you can hear that are happening in the way that I'm pronouncing words. None of this is actually recorded in the writing system. So think if you're a learner of English, you're a foreign learner of English, learning English, and you didn't know that the T in English can be pronounced as a D sound, and you hear better, you have no idea what I just said because you were expecting the word better or better. And if you heard a British person say better with the glottal stop, you'd probably still be confused about what was that letter they just used, because glottal stop is sometimes a K in other languages. So they, you know, maybe an Indonesian speaker might be trying to put a K into that position and thinking like, what is Becker? Becker, I don't understand what that means, okay? So, like for example, a Chinese child, a Chinese native speaker, if they're learning English and they're told a T is always pronounced T, and then they heard me say a sentence like, I finished editing the article earlier today, they'd probably have no idea what I just said. Even if they grew up learning English and they knew all those words in the sentence, they just wouldn't understand the string of sounds that I just put together, because there were so many sound changes in that sentence because of my natural way of speaking. So can you imagine if you're learning a foreign language and there's so many sound changes that are happening from the way native speakers actually speak? For example, this happens in Russian, in Korean, or English, of course, Thai, and a bunch of other languages. Then it can be a really big barrier for you being able to achieve fluency. That's why it's a really bad idea to use the writing system to learn how to speak a foreign language. It's really important to hear what people are saying, repeat after them, and then learn all of those sound changes kind of naturally, and then try to match it with the writing system. Because in the writing system usually simplifies things. It's a lossy format. So you have a bunch of sounds like a and a d and a t that all become a T in the writing system. So it's kind of actually pretty easy to remember, oh, that's all just a T in English. And so going from a T to however many different sounds are produced from the T, that can be actually harder than the other way around. So what we call that common denominator in the IPA, or to unify all of these spoken languages, is what we call an IPA a phonemic writing system. So most writing systems are phonemic in nature. They only give you the least amount of data in order to pull out the meaning out of what was conveyed in that sentence. So for native speakers, it's really great and really convenient to be able to write fast and be able to read fast. They don't want to waste their time on a lot of details on how I actually pronounce stuff myself. That's not a very good use case for native speakers. So they like to get their ideas across quickly. So in IPA, we can actually write more details. The great thing about IPA is that we can do this. And so there's a different way that we can write is called phonetic. And now what phonetic does, it takes all of those changes, like what I just did with the T in English, and I can actually write it into the script and show you as a learner what's happening in my language. So if you're learning Russian or Korean on Glossika and you want to know why does toklip become tongnip in Korean, or hapnita become hamnida, why does the Russian osobieno become osobiena? You know, why does the sound change in a certain way? You can actually see that in the IPA transcription. And so if you want to learn more about the IPA in general, you can go over to the Glossika's phonics channel on YouTube, and you can also log into your Glossika account and start learning a language that has that IPA transcription. We provide it for almost every language, and you can see how it works for the language that you're learning. And it should be able to help you figure out some of the pronunciation errors that you're making, and maybe some areas where you're not actually understanding native speakers very well. You can see what's happening right there in the IPA. So good luck to you, and hope to see you on the platform soon.